The night Eliza Moore agreed to marry a stranger, the wind screamed through the mountain valley like something alive. It clawed at the walls of the old cabin and slipped through the cracks between the logs. The lantern hanging above the table flickered wildly, throwing shadows across the room. Outside, the mountains stood silent and dark, their snowy peaks hidden behind thick clouds. Inside the small cabin, Eliza Moore sat beside her father's bed, holding a damp cloth in her trembling hands. But her father was dying. Thomas Moore had once been the strongest man in the valley. He hauled freight across mountain passes and lifted crates heavier than most men could move. But the fever had taken that strength away piece by piece. Now he lay thin and pale under a worn blanket, his chest rising and falling with painful effort. Each breath sounded like stones rattling in a tin cup. Eliza pressed the cloth gently to his forehead. "You should sleep," her father whispered. So should you," she replied quietly. Thomas Moore managed a weak smile before another coughing fit shook his body. The sound echoed in the small cabin, rough and wet. Eliza looked away. She had heard that cough too many times. For months she had watched the illness steal her father's strength. The doctor in town had called it lung fever. Medicine cost money. Rest required food and warmth. They had neither. Eliza's gaze drifted to the corner of the room, where 2 wooden crates chinned against the wall, only 2. A week earlier there had been 6. She had sold almost everything they owned. Her mother's dishes, the mule, the good tools, even the rocking chair her mother used to sit in during long winter evenings. All of it had gone to pay for medicine and food. Still, the money had vanished faster than snow under spring sun. Her father turned his head slowly toward her. Samuel Carrick came by yesterday," he said weakly. Eliza's hand froze. Carrick was the man who owned most of the land in the valley and half the businesses in town. When people owed money, Carrick collected. "What did he say?" she asked quietly. "What they always say. Pay your debts or lose the land." Eliza swallowed hard. The land had belonged to their family for 15 years. Her father had worked himself nearly to death to buy it. "How long?" she asked. Thomas closed his eyes briefly. 3 days. The words landed like a hammer. 3 days. After that, Carrick would file papers with the territorial court. The land would be seized and sold. Their home would be gone. "How much do we owe?" Eliza asked. $240. Eliza almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was impossible. She had counted their money that morning. $11.30. That was all they had left. And her father looked at her with tired eyes filled with regret. "I'm sorry, Eliza." "Don't," she said quickly. "You got sick. That's not something you can control." Thomas coughed again, gripping the blanket. "There might be another way." Eliza frowned. "What do you mean?" "A man came to see me this morning." The words made Eliza uneasy. "What kind of man?" Thomas hesitated before answering. The kind looking for a wife." Eliza stood so quickly the chair behind her scraped across the floor. "No." "He offered to pay the debts." "No." "In exchange for marriage." Eliza walked to the small window and pulled back the oilcloth covering it. The night outside was black and endless. "I won't be sold like cattle," she said. "It's not like that," Thomas replied softly. "Then what is it?" She turned around, anger flashing in her eyes. "Thought a stranger wants to marry a woman he's never met. And somehow, he appears exactly when we're about to lose everything." Her father struggled to sit up slightly. "I call it a chance." Eliza crossed her arms. "A chance to trade one prison for another. A chance to survive." The word hung in the air. Survive. Thomas looked older than she had ever seen him. I'm dying, Eliza, he said quietly. And when I'm gone, you'll have nothing. The truth struck her like a blow, yet a 23-year-old woman alone in the mountains with no money, no protection, and winter coming. Life in the territory was hard even for men. For women alone, it could be deadly. What's his name? She asked finally. Jonah Hale. Where does he live? High in the mountains past Elkhorn Pass. A mountain man? Trapper mostly. Eliza frowned. Mountain trappers were rough men. They spent months alone in the wilderness living off wild game and furs. Well, they were not the kind of men who paid $240 to marry strangers. What does he want exactly? She asked. Company. A wife to manage his home. Thomas studied her carefully. He said he'd pay every debt we owe. In return, you marry him. Eliza stared at the floor. Something about it felt wrong. Too convenient. Too sudden. What does he look like? She asked. Tall, broad shoulders, dark hair, beard. How old? 30 maybe? Hard to tell. Did he seem dangerous? Thomas thought about that. No, he said slowly. Cold, maybe. Careful, but not cruel. When does he want an answer? Tomorrow night. Silence filled the cabin. The wind outside howled louder, as if the mountains themselves were waiting for her answer. Eliza sat beside her father again and took his hand. I'll meet him, she said quietly. As Thomas studied her face. You don't have to do this. Yes, I do. They both knew it was true. The next evening, Jonah Hale arrived exactly at sunset. Eliza was outside splitting wood when she heard a horse approaching along the rocky trail. She did not stop working. If this man wanted to see the woman he was proposing to marry, he would see her exactly as she was. Sweaty, tired, covered in sawdust. The horse came into view first. A strong bay stallion with polished tack and well-trimmed hooves. Too well cared for to belong to an ordinary trapper. Then the rider appeared. Jonah Hale swung down from the saddle with the quiet confidence of someone used to hard country. Eliza studied him carefully. He was taller than she expected. His coat was worn but well made. His boots were expensive leather. And when he removed his gloves, his hands were rough but clean. Not the hands of a man who lived constantly in dirt and fur. His eyes were gray, sharp, observant. Miss Moore, he said calmly. His voice was deep and steady. Mr. Hale, she replied. You're punctual. I try to be. He glanced at the cabin behind her. How is your father? Dying, she said bluntly. You already knew that. Something flickered in his expression. Your honesty is refreshing. You're here to profit from it. I'm here to offer a solution. Eliza folded her arms. You call this a solution? Yes. Jonah met her gaze without hesitation. You need security. I need a wife. Sounds romantic. I didn't promise romance. He said it so simply that Eliza almost laughed. At least you're honest. Always. Why me? Jonah paused before answering. No, it's because women in Denver society expect things I can't give them. Like what? Parties. Attention. A husband who spends every day with them. He glanced toward the mountains rising behind the cabin. I live far from that world. So you decided to buy a wife instead. I'm offering partnership. You're offering survival, Eliza corrected. He nodded slightly. Yes. There was no pity in his eyes, no manipulation, just simple truth. Jonah reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a leather folder. The contracts are inside. Read them. Eliza opened it cautiously. Inside were several legal documents written in neat handwriting. One showed the payment of her father's debts. Another transferred ownership of the Moore land directly into her name. The third was a marriage contract. She read every line slowly. When she finished, she looked up. You're giving me the land even if the marriage ends? Yes. Why? Because I don't want a prisoner, Jonah said. I want a partner. The wind rustled through the pine trees behind them. Eliza studied the stranger standing in front of her. He was hiding something. That much was obvious. But he was also offering her something no one else had. A future. All right, she said finally. I'll marry you. Jonah nodded once. Good. No smile, no celebration, just quiet acceptance. When? She asked. Tomorrow morning. The next day they rode to town together. The banker counted Jonah's money and paid every debt owed to Samuel Carrick. The land deed was signed and placed in Eliza's hands. For the first time in months, she could breathe. Then they walked into the judge's office. The ceremony lasted less than 5 minutes. Jonah slid a plain silver ring onto her finger. I now pronounce you husband and wife, the judge said. Jonah looked at Eliza. She looked back. Instead of kissing, they shook hands. By evening, they were riding north into the mountains. Eliza did not look back. She had married a stranger, and she had no idea what kind of life waited for her beyond the high mountain passes. The mountains grew steeper the farther north they rode. Eliza had traveled through these passes before with her father, but never this deep into the high country. But the trail twisted through narrow ridges and dense pine forests where sunlight barely reached the ground. Jonah rode ahead of her most of the time. Silent. Watchful. He moved through the mountains like a man who knew every rock and shadow. Occasionally, he slowed his horse and pointed out a safer path or warned her about loose stones along the trail. But he spoke very little. Eliza didn't mind the silence. It gave her time to think. She had married a man she barely knew, a man who spoke carefully and revealed almost nothing about himself. Yet something about him felt different from the rough mountain men she had grown up around. Jonah Hale did not move like a trapper. He moved like someone used to being in control. By late afternoon, the air grew colder as they climbed higher. Eliza's horse struggled up the rocky slope, while thin clouds drifted across the peaks above them. Jonah glanced back at her. You holding up? He asked. I'm fine. You're breathing too hard. I've ridden worse trails. Jonah studied her for a moment, then nodded. There's a shelter up ahead. We'll stop there tonight. Sure enough, half an hour later, they reached a small stone cabin built against the side of a cliff. It looked sturdy and well-maintained. Too well-maintained for something used only by passing trappers. Jonah dismounted first and helped Eliza down. Her legs were stiff from the long ride. Inside the cabin, a small fireplace stood against the wall. Shelves held dried meat, flour, and sealed jars. Someone had clearly been using the place recently. You built this? Eliza asked. I keep a few shelters along my routes, Jonah replied, while lighting a fire. For storms or long trap runs. Eliza nodded slowly. Everything about him raised new questions. A man who owned multiple cabins across the mountains was not an ordinary trapper. They ate a simple dinner of jerky and hard bread, and the fire crackled softly while the wind howled outside. When the meal was finished, Jonah pointed toward the narrow cot against the wall. You take the bed. And you? I'll sleep by the fire. Eliza frowned slightly. We're married. Jonah looked at her calmly. Only if you want us to be. The words surprised her. Most men would not have asked. Eliza lay down on the cot without answering. Exhaustion pulled her into sleep almost instantly. She woke sometime in the middle of the night. The fire had burned low, filling the cabin with soft orange light. Jonah sat beside it, cleaning a rifle. He didn't look up, but his voice broke the silence. Go back to sleep. You don't sleep? Later. Eliza studied him quietly for a moment. There was something lonely about the way he sat there in the quiet darkness. She turned over and closed her eyes again. Morning came early, but Jonah already had the horses saddled by the time she stepped outside. The air smelled sharp and cold. Frost covered the grass like white dust. They rode again without many words. The second day was harder than the first. The trail climbed higher into rocky terrain, where trees grew thin and twisted by mountain winds. Eagles circled overhead, and snow still clung to the highest peaks. By midday, Eliza's lungs burned from the thin air. Jonah slowed his horse. We're close now." "How close?" "Just over that ridge." They climbed the final slope slowly. Eliza urged her horse forward beside him. Then they reached the top, and Eliza stopped breathing. Below them lay a valley that seemed impossible. Green meadows stretched between thick forests of pine and aspen. A silver river wound through the center like a ribbon of light. And in the middle of the valley stood a massive lodge. Not a cabin. A lodge. 2 full stories tall. Massive log walls. Stone chimneys. Wide porches and tall windows that glittered in the sun. Nearby stood several other buildings. A barn, a smokehouse, a workshop. Everything looked strong and well built. It was the kind of estate wealthy businessmen built for hunting retreats, not the home of a mountain trapper. Eliza stared at it in disbelief. "What is this?" Jonah watched her reaction carefully. It's home. You're a trapper." "I am. Trappers don't live in places like that." "This one does." He nudged his horse forward and began riding down the slope. Eliza followed slowly, her mind spinning with confusion. The closer they got, the stranger everything looked. The meadows had been cleared of rocks. Irrigation channels guided water from the river across the fields. The barn was large enough for several horses, as the lodge itself looked warm and welcoming, with smoke rising from one chimney. This wasn't wilderness survival. This was wealth. Jonah dismounted in front of the lodge and tied the horses to a hitching post. Eliza slid down from her saddle, but barely noticed her tired legs. Her eyes stayed fixed on the enormous building. "You said you were a trapper." Jonah opened the front door. "I said that was one of the things I do." "Then what are the other things?" He hesitated. Complicated ones." Eliza stepped inside. The main room of the lodge was breathtaking. High ceilings supported by thick wooden beams. A huge stone fireplace, large enough to stand inside. Soft rugs covered the floor. Shelves filled with books lined the walls. Real glass windows let sunlight pour into the room. It felt like stepping into another world. Eliza slowly turned in a circle. "You live here alone?" "Most of the time." "Jonah, this place costs a fortune." "Yes." Her eyes narrowed. "You've been lying to me." "I haven't lied." "You let me believe you were a poor trapper." "I let you believe I was a trapper." He removed his coat and hung it near the door. Then he looked at her seriously. "My full name is Jonah William Hale." The name meant nothing to her. "My father was Richard Hale." Eliza blinked. The name was familiar. Too familiar. "Hale Timber," she said slowly. Jonah nodded. "My father owned one of the largest logging companies in 3 territories. Eliza felt the room spin slightly. Everyone in Colorado knew that name. Hale Timber controlled forests from Wyoming to New Mexico. Hundreds of men worked in its camps. "You're the heir to that company?" "I was." "What happened?" Jonah walked to the fireplace and began lighting a fire. "When my father died 5 years ago, and he left the company to me." "That sounds like good news." "For everyone except my Aunt Margaret." Eliza leaned against the table listening. "She had spent 20 years managing finances," Jonah continued. "She expected to inherit control. But your father chose you." "Yes." "So she tried to take it from you." Jonah nodded slowly. "First, she challenged the will. Then she convinced the board I was too young and inexperienced. Were you? Yes, he said it simply. I knew forests and land, but I didn't understand politics or corporate power. What happened? She turned the board against me. Jonah stared into the flames. Within 6 months, I was fighting lawsuits and accusations. Every decision I made was twisted into evidence of incompetence. So you left. I made a deal. He turned toward her again. I gave the board temporary control of operations. In exchange, they stopped trying to remove me completely. For how long? 10 years. Eliza frowned. And during those 10 years, I stay away from the company. And live here. Yes. The story slowly began to make sense. You're hiding. I'm waiting. For what? For the agreement to expire. Jonah met her eyes. When those 10 years end, the company returns fully to me. Eliza crossed her arms. And your aunt? She's still trying to destroy me. How? By proving I'm morally unfit to own the company. Eliza raised an eyebrow. How does marrying me help with that? Because she has people watching me. Jonah walked to the window overlooking the valley. If I lived alone with a string of women visiting the lodge, she could accuse me of immoral behavior. But if you're married, then there's no scandal. Eliza stared at him. So, I'm protection. You're my shield. And my reward for that service is security. Jonah turned back toward her. A home, land, and independence. Eliza considered everything she had just learned. You chose me because I was desperate. I chose you because you're strong. Jonah stepped closer. I asked around town about you. What did they say? That you're honest. That you work harder than most men. That you never complain. He paused. I needed someone who wouldn't break under pressure. Eliza studied his face. And if I had refused, I still would have paid your father's medical debts. Her eyes widened. Why? Because no one should die worrying about money. The word surprised her. Jonah Hale was richer than she had ever imagined. Yet he lived alone in the mountains and spent his days trapping and building furniture. Maybe the world he came from had hurt him more than she understood. What do you need from me? She asked. To live here with me. And? To be seen as my wife if anyone comes asking questions. Is that all? No. Jonah hesitated. I also need someone I can trust. Eliza nodded slowly. I can do that. And what do you want? He asked. The question caught her off guard. No one had asked her what she wanted in a long time. I want to learn, she said finally. Learn what? Everything. She gestured toward the valley outside the windows. How to survive here, how to manage land, how to build something real. Jonah watched her quietly. I can teach you. Then we have a deal. He extended his hand. Eliza looked at it. Then she shook it. A strange warmth passed between them. For the first time since the wedding, the marriage didn't feel like a contract. It felt like the beginning of something unexpected. Jonah gave her a tour of the property that afternoon. The barn held 4 strong horses. The smokehouse was packed with venison and elk meat. The workshop contained tools for building furniture. You made these? Eliza asked, touching a finished chair. Sometimes. You're good. It keeps my mind busy. They walked beside the river as sunset painted the mountains gold. This valley belonged to my father, Jonah explained. He planned to build this lodge as a retreat. But he died before finishing it. Yes. So you finished it. Jonah nodded. Now it's the one place my aunt can't touch. Eliza looked around at the peaceful valley. It was beautiful, but it was also a hiding place. Jonah Hale was a man running from a war he couldn't fight yet. And she had just married him. That night they ate dinner together at the huge wooden table. The room felt strangely quiet for such a large house. You'll get used to it, Jonah said. The silence? The mountains. Eliza glanced toward the dark windows. I think I already have. But as she went upstairs to her room later that night, she couldn't stop thinking about one thing. She had married a man worth a fortune, a man with enemies powerful enough to destroy him, and somehow she had become part of that fight. She just didn't know how soon that fight would begin. For the first few weeks, and life in the hidden valley felt almost peaceful. Eliza woke early each morning to the sound of the river flowing through the meadow. Mist often covered the grass until the sun climbed high enough to burn it away. Jonah was usually already awake. Sometimes he was repairing tools in the workshop. Other mornings, he was studying maps spread across the large dining table. He had begun teaching her everything he knew: how to track animals, how to read the sky before storms, how to judge the health of forests by the color of the bark and leaves. Eliza absorbed every lesson like someone starving for knowledge. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving. She was building something. They worked side by side most days. During the evenings, they shared meals, sometimes talking about the land, sometimes sitting in comfortable silence while the fire crackled. Their marriage had started as a contract. But something about living and working together in the valley slowly changed the way they looked at each other. Respect came first, then trust. And slowly, quietly, something deeper began to grow. 3 weeks after Eliza arrived in the valley, that quiet life was shattered. It happened on a cool autumn afternoon. Eliza and Jonah had spent the morning riding along the northern ridge, checking timber stands. The air smelled of pine and cold stone. As they climbed back toward the lodge, Jonah suddenly stopped his horse. His eyes narrowed toward the valley below. Eliza followed his gaze. Smoke was rising near the barn, but Jonah had not left a fire burning there. "Someone's here," he said quietly. Eliza's heart skipped. "Visitors?" "Not invited ones." Jonah turned his horse quickly. "Stay behind the ridge." "What?" "If anything goes wrong, ride north, and don't stop until you reach the Morrison homestead." Eliza stared at him. You think it's dangerous?" "I don't take chances." His voice had turned cold. Eliza nodded slowly. She watched as Jonah rode down toward the lodge alone. From her position on the ridge, she could see 3 horses tied near the barn. 3 men stood waiting in the yard. Even from a distance, she could tell they were not ordinary travelers. Their coats were expensive, their posture confident. Men used to being obeyed. Jonah stopped 20 feet from them. This is private land," he called. "State your business." The man in front stepped forward. He was older, with silver hair and a confident smile. "Jonah Hale," he said smoothly. "Still hiding in the mountains, I see." Eliza felt a chill run through her. The voice carried clearly across the quiet valley. "You shouldn't be here," Jonah replied. "Family has a right to visit." Family. Eliza's stomach tightened. Then the man spoke again. "Won't you greet your uncle properly?" Jonah's rifle lifted slightly. "You stopped being family 5 years ago, Richard." Eliza's mind raced. Richard Hale. Jonah had mentioned him once. The man who helped Margaret try to steal the company. "We heard interesting news," Richard continued casually. "Heard you got married." Jonah said nothing. "So we came to meet the bride." From the ridge, Eliza realized something terrible. Richard wasn't here for a visit, and he was here to prove the marriage was fake. If Jonah refused to show her, it would look suspicious. If she appeared nervous or uncertain, they would claim the marriage was a fraud. And if that happened, Margaret could destroy Jonah's claim to the company. Eliza took a deep breath. Then she did something Jonah had specifically told her not to do. She rode down into the valley. Jonah saw her first. His expression flashed with surprise, then with understanding. Eliza dismounted beside him. She stood straight, calm, and looked directly at the strangers. "You must be family," she said evenly. "I'm Elizabeth Hale." Richard's eyes moved slowly over her. taking in her simple dress, her steady posture, the wedding ring on her hand. "Mrs. Hale," he said with a thin smile. "A pleasure." "What brings you here?" Eliza asked. Richard clasped his hands behind his back. "Concern." "About what?" "About my nephew's well-being." His smile grew colder. "You see, rumors suggest this marriage might not be genuine." Eliza almost laughed. "Rumors are often wrong. We'd like to confirm that." Jonah's voice sharpened. "You're not coming inside." "Then I suppose we'll assume the marriage is a lie." The trap was obvious. But Eliza stepped forward. "You may come in," she said calmly. Jonah looked at her sharply. "It's fine," she murmured. Richard's eyes gleamed. "Excellent." Inside the lodge, the men examined everything. The kitchen, the library, the bedrooms upstairs. Richard paused when he noticed the separate rooms. "Interesting," he said. "Newlyweds with separate beds." Eliza met his gaze. "My husband respects my wishes." Richard smiled thinly. "I'm sure the trustees will find that fascinating." Eliza folded her arms. "The law requires a legal marriage, not a shared mattress." For the first time, Richard hesitated. He hadn't expected resistance. "Margaret will hear about this," he said coldly. "Tell her whatever you like," Eliza replied. "We're not hiding anything." Richard studied her carefully. Then he nodded once. "We'll see." The men left shortly afterward. When their horses finally disappeared beyond the ridge, Jonah closed the door slowly. "You shouldn't have come down," he said. "Yes, I should have." Eliza faced him. "They were going to destroy you." Jonah ran a hand through his hair. "Now, Margaret knows about you." "Let her know." Eliza stepped closer. "I'm not afraid of her." Jonah studied her face. Something new appeared in his eyes. Respect. Maybe even admiration. "You handled that better than I would have," he admitted. "Good." She allowed herself a small smile. "Because I have a feeling this isn't over." It wasn't. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived from Denver. The Hale Timber Board demanded Jonah and his wife attend a company reception. "The trustees want to meet you," Jonah said quietly. "It's a trap." "Of course it is." Eliza folded the letter carefully. "Then we go." Jonah looked surprised. "You understand what that means? We show them our marriage is real. And if they try to tear us apart?" Eliza met his eyes steadily. "Then we don't let them." 2 weeks later, they stood inside the grand ballroom of the Brown Palace Hotel in Denver. The room glittered with chandeliers and polished marble. Wealthy businessmen filled the hall, and at the center of it all stood Margaret Hale. She approached them slowly. Her smile was perfect. Her eyes were ice. "Jonah," she said sweetly, "and this must be your bride." "Eliza," Jonah said calmly. Margaret studied her carefully. "How fascinating," she murmured. "A mountain girl joining the Hale family." Eliza smiled politely. "I married Jonah, not the family." Several nearby guests choked on their drinks. Margaret's smile tightened. During dinner, the interrogation began. Board members asked endless questions. Where Eliza grew up, how they met, how they lived in the valley. Each question was designed to expose weakness. But Eliza answered everyone calmly. When Margaret finally asked if the marriage was real, Eliza simply took Jonah's hand. Of course it's real," she said. "I love my husband." The room fell silent. Jonah looked at her in shock. She had never said those words before. But the strange thing was, they felt true. Later that night, as they walked through the quiet Denver streets, Jonah finally spoke. "You meant that?" "Yes." Eliza looked at him. "Somewhere between the mountains and this ridiculous ballroom, and I realized something." "What?" "This stopped being a contract a long time ago." Jonah's voice softened. I was afraid to say it first. Why? Because if you didn't feel the same, Eliza stopped walking. Then she kissed him. Right there in the middle of the street. When she pulled away, Jonah looked stunned. Well, she said quietly, now you know. The board review happened 1 month later. Margaret tried everything to destroy them. She questioned their marriage, their living arrangements, their motives. But Jonah had spent 3 years preparing for that moment. He presented records proving Margaret had been stealing money from the company. The trustees were shocked. The investigation began immediately. Margaret lost her position on the board within weeks. 2 years later, Jonah reclaimed full control of Hale Timber. But the most important victory happened long before that. It happened quietly in a mountain valley. One cold winter evening, Eliza and Jonah sat together on the lodge porch. Snow covered the meadows below. The river moved slowly beneath thin ice. Do you regret it? Jonah asked. Regret what? Marrying a stranger. Eliza looked at the valley, at the home they had built together. Then she held up her hand. The simple silver ring still rested beside a new sapphire one Jonah had given her months earlier. No, she said softly. I think it was the best mistake I ever made. Jonah smiled. Good. Because marrying you was the best decision I ever made. The wind moved gently through the pine trees. The mountains stood silent around them, and in a hidden valley far from the world, a marriage that began as survival had become something far stronger. Not a contract, not a bargain, but a partnership built on trust, respect, and love.